Now continue writing.
Good everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Department of History's latest Faculty Book Talk. Faculty Book Talk has become a tradition of sorts here at UCF. We've had 2 or 3 of these. And it's a wonderful opportunity for you to get an understanding of what professional historians at UCF do on an everyday basis. I don't know if we write books every day, but we do it a lot. We spend a lot of our time doing this. First thing I'd like to do is I'd like to thank my colleague, Jim Clark, for helping organize this. Please, round of applause. John Clark is a big advocate of history research, and he's organized these before. We owe him a lot for doing that, so thank you, Dr. Clark. The other thing I'd like to do before we get started is I'd like to introduce the UCF College of Arts and Humanities Executive Associate Dean, Lyman Brody. He'd like to make an introduction.
Well, let me first of all congratulate these wonderful colleagues in front. Okay? Because one of the things I'm most proud of at UCF is that you have a faculty here that actually do what they teach. So pay attention on you guys, right? Because if you want to be here, you need to do what these folks are doing. Okay? It's a really important thing. I don't take that lightly. Trust me, it's a really important thing. But I'm going to be very brief. I want to introduce Simon Dickel. Dr. Dickel is here with us from Germany, and he's going to be with us until February. And the reason he's here is he is the CAR visiting scholar. There's a group, the acronym is CAAR, it's the Collegium of African American Research. They are primarily a European-based group. They typically hold their conferences in Europe, and they've only held their conference in the United States only once before. And this year, they will be here on our campus January 30th through February 2nd. So Dr. Dickel is here as part of that CAR relationship. And he's actually housed on your floor. So you will be seeing him around. He's actually in your corridors. But I wanted to make sure you all had a chance to see him and meet him, before we finish today. So thank you for having the opportunity to introduce him at this event. And congratulations to all of you all for your accomplishments. Thank you so much.
Also, I should say the reason I'm not standing up is we're told to keep seated because we're also kind of streaming this online. And if you can see over there the laptop, that's how we're doing it. So no one move very much as you're talking, but I guess is the way to say that. What we're going to try to do tonight is it's pretty casual. That's one reason we're sitting in these comfortable chairs. This is going to be a fairly casual explanation or just chat about the scholarship these 4 faculty members have produced. Essentially what they're going to do is they're going to take from 7 to 10 minutes to talk a bit about their book, but more importantly, talk about the writing process. For the students in the audience, we know you love to write. We know you love the writing process. But what they're going to do today is they're going to show you that there is no single writing process. They're going to tell you about the different ways you can go about creating very effective and important scholarship. So we'll simply, I'll introduce each of them, I'll introduce them, and then when it's their turn, I'll introduce the next person. And simply they're going to give us a little overview of what their book is about. Again, a little bit about the writing process. Once we get to the end, we'll have plenty of time for you to ask questions and to actually meet with the faculty members individually to kind of ask them any questions or get any insights you want. So, having said that, we'll start with the first person on my left. If you don't know her, this is Dr. Barbara Gannon. She's an associate professor of history at UCF. She's been here 8 years?
This is ninth.
Ninth year, okay. Dr. Gannon got her PhD in history from Penn State University. Her research interests are in veterans, U.S. military history before 1900, the Civil War, and memory. Dr. Gannon has already been a prolific publisher of research. Her books, Americans Remember Their Civil War, came out in 2017. She also co-authored Pennsylvania, a Military History. It was published in 2016. And of course, her historiography-changing book, The One Cause, Black and White Comradeship in the Grand Army of the Republic, appeared in 2011, and it received an honorable mention for the Lincoln Prize, one of the best literary prizes you can get. It was a finalist for the Jefferson Davis Prize in 2012, and it received the Wiley Silver Prize in 2012 for the best first book on the Civil War. What she's going to talk about today is Americans Remember Their Civil War. Again?
Well, hello. I wrote down some notes because one thing you have to know, they give you 7 to 10 minutes, and if you just go spontaneously on anything you've written, we'll be 7 to 10 hours later. Well, okay, first, I'm going to talk about the one key, probably the key question of all Civil War memory, and really the key question I answered in my book. I did a lot of different things, but this is the fundamental question. The fundamental question is, quite simply, why was the lost cause, which is Confederate Civil War memory, so much more successful than the Union cause? More memorable. Much of what people remembered about the Civil War through the 20th century was the lost cause version of what happened. Even today, some people do. The current monument debates are about the lost cause. But it's way stronger than a few stone men on horses. It really is. If there's a lost cause of memory in the Civil War, it's the Union cause. Now, today I'm going to talk about memory too. Now, what is memory? Memory is what I'm talking about when Americans remember their Civil War. Because otherwise, the story would have ended and petered out and the last person in the Civil War generation died, but it didn't. Then there's history. People talk about memory and history. Well, people confuse them because they're very interrelated, particularly in Civil War memory. People think, well, the history part is the academic version, and that's a pretty good explanation. And memory is the popular memory of something, how people remember it. But you see, when it comes to the Civil War, it's sort of the history of the war has really often been a battle between sectional memories and people who were affected by one memory or the other. First, the lost cause. I won't give it too much time, it already has gotten too much. After the war, Confederate supporters remembered the U.S. government's wrong-headed effort to stop peaceful secession. If slavery mattered, it was about radical abolitionists' attempt to interfere with this beneficial institution. Confederates recalled a defensive struggle to establish an independent nation in the face of a savage Union assault. When this failed, they rejected any notion that they were wrong. The memory of an honorable defeat against overwhelming odds sanctified their memories and justified their wartime losses. Today, a lot of Americans object to this, partly because it's very closely linked to racism and white supremacy. Well, before the war, some Southerners held Black Americans in slavery. During the war, they fought to preserve this institution. Afterwards, they used all their power, including violence, to reestablish white supremacy in an ostensibly free and democratic society. Well into the 20th century, as late as the Civil Rights Movement, lost cause ideology justified race-based discrimination against African Americans. Southerners who opposed integration flew Confederate flags. The Ku Klux Klan flew Confederate flags. They put them in state flags, purposely. The Confederate flags and state flags are from the 1950s. So, what I came to was memory and history. How the war is remembered isn't really about the war, but the times that it was remembered in, whether it was 1910 or 1950. And the key is, the war generation remembers it one way, but generations afterwards remember it in whatever way is suitable to their times, or shaped by their times. It actually has nothing to do with the war itself. So let's spend time on the lost memory. What did the Unionist Civil War generation remember? And I've done a lot of work on that. Federal supporters remembered that the war was an attempt to destroy the Union and to preserve slavery that failed because of their generation's suffering and sacrifice. Many Union supporters, but not all, believed that ending slavery was central to the memory of what they accomplished. They remembered the secession crisis was the culmination of a decade of agitation over slavery. They realized slave owners succeeded to protect slavery because Lincoln and the Republicans, they believed, would destroy it. They remembered the war as only successful, and this is very key, when they decided to free the slaves. They had been doing poorly up to that point. And they came to this place where, well, regardless of how they felt about it, African Americans or race, you could not save the Union without freeing the slaves. Now, some scholars suggested that they forgot, and they did not forget slavery. And I'll tell you what they really didn't forget. They saw the war as treason, flat out treason. And they said that all the time. And they really rejected this whole, they were more gallant, but we were outnumbered. They thought that it was the righteousness of their cause and the heroic volunteer soldiers of the Union that saved the Union and freed the slaves. Now, really, only recently did scholars ever even care about this much. Like, try the 21st century. The first book even addressing this was, a few years, 2005. I'm not sure it's permeated the public at all. I hope my book, which I wrote in an accessible way, will help that. For a long time, they were seen as less dedicated to their cause than their more Southern counterparts. And everyone said, well, they went to blue and gray reunions, they liked Confederates, they forgot about the war, they embraced them as fellow soldiers. Now, they did attend some reunions, and they did have sympathy for the common rebel soldier, as they would call them. But they rejected their cause. They rejected the idea that it was right or better or equal to theirs. And particularly the leaders, Lee and Davis. I don't even know what they'd say if I told them there were still monuments to Lee around. So they have a very clear idea. But people forgot that, particularly after they passed on. That generation, the next generation, doesn't want to be reminded of discord and disunion. I mean, no one wants to think the nation tried to, destroy itself. And they also they remembered race-based slavery, which is what people said they forgot. But honestly, the reason why they could remember it and have a more positive attitude toward the South and to forget the terrible times was they thought slavery was fine. And a lot of that had to do with their racism. They were, in a lot of ways, as racist as the Southerners. There was no real difference in some ways, particularly 1900 and past that. Jim Crow and segregation and disenfranchisement in the South, they were fine with because they had a lot of the same racial views. Now, there's one great lie that worked for the lost cause that I found. It was that slavery was a beneficial institution. White Americans at the turn of the century and later accepted that Confederates were defending slavery and had no problem with it, really. And some Americans even got to this point where, particularly when people rejected World War I and war itself, that why did we fight over ending slavery, which is such a great idea? They don't say great idea, but they practically say it. Now, of course, we don't believe that anymore. Now, this is, I think, the next really important for most Americans. It's about union and reunion and the nation coming together, particularly since America would be on its way to this industrial might nation. It would become an empire. We would have many wars, and people wanted a unity. And they didn't matter much if it was a black and white. They focused on sort of a white unity. And they got into this sort of romance of reunion, that there was something romantic about pre-war Southern society, its agrarian nature. And it seemed better than industrial society with immigrants and women who held jobs and had opinions. People appealed to them, that sort of world. So as part of the thing, they came up with this idea of sort of a transcendent white American military heroism that included Confederates, that sort of served our wars in the 20th century. Now, if you want the perfect example, I can talk about books and we can go through all this, the movie Gone with the Wind. is perfect. And this was the #1 movie in 1939. You see, you have an idyllic South that's gone. You have valiant women who really wear big dresses and don't work and don't have opinions and are very flirty. You have valiant men who protect their women during and after the war. That whole Reconstruction scenario. The slaves are happy. Why would anyone want to be free? Why did we try to free them? But it's also funny because in 1939, people had really rejected World War I. So in a way, it doesn't saying war is right. It has an unnecessary war. It shows you the scene of Atlanta burning, the wounded. So it very much reflects 1939 sensibilities. The key, though, is after World War II, African Americans who were always there, and I talk about them in the book, and their ideas of memory. The civil rights movement really changed things. Once you gave up on the idea that African Americans were inferior, or you couldn't hold that, or at least you couldn't say it out loud, let's put it that way. Or a lot of people embraced a more equal view. Slavery was more likely to be rejected, and people thought more favorably of the Union cause, which ended it. And it was weird, it happened in the Cold War at the same time as there was a lot of pushback, because people wanted a united American memory to face communism. But the stronger one was the civil rights movement. And that was key. And that's what Americans started waking up to. Before that, the lost causes, and I read textbooks, was pretty much accepted. There were no challenges. But you had to change the idea of Black lives, which we always talk about, Black lives freedom, Black lives matter. Because there had gotten to be this point where people, when they looked at the Civil War, came to think, well, the war and the Northern effort wasn't worth it, because why would you lose all those people to free Black people? Black lives had to matter before you would accept the Union cause. Black freedom had to matter. So that was really sort of the main question. Whenever you're a historian, that's your issue. How I did this is kind of an unusual book. It's mostly about what other people have said. But the key thing I did, which is a little different, I looked at historians in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and I looked at how I used them as an example of memory, which most people aren't crazy about, because they try to think, well, you're an academic historian, you don't do memory. But they did memory, they shaped it. And they were men of the South and of the North, and they were people who had views of World War I. And their history reflected a lot of their issues in the present. So it's an odd book in that it's sort of historiography, which is when we talk about whether to say, but I sort of use the historians as a primary source to delve into how Americans remembered the Civil War. So I tried to keep it light and breezy, as I'll keep this presentation, I hope, because the publisher said 75,000 words. And let me tell you, American memory of the Civil War in 75,000 words is a little tough. But thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gannon. It's outstanding. Our next speaker today, Dr. Gannon's left, is Dr. David Head. He is a lecturer here in the UCF History Department. He got his PhD from State University of New York System School of Buffalo in 2010. His research interests are the American Revolution, the early American Republic, the Atlantic world, maritime history, and pirates and privateers. Thus, his first book was titled Privateers of the Americas, Spanish-American Privateering in the United States in the early Republic, which was published in 2015. It received the John Gardner Maritime Research Award for the best maritime book at the time. He's also editor of the Encyclopedia of the Atlantic World, 1400 to 1900, Europe, Africa, and the Americas, and an age of exploration, trade, and empires. But when you think of Dr. David Head, you need to think pirates. What he's going to talk about today is his most recent book, his edited book, The Golden Age of Piracy. Dr. Head.
Well, thank you very much for that the warm introduction, Dan. I appreciate it. I have a nice pirate cover here on the book, which I really enjoyed. It came out looking great. Thank you everyone for coming this afternoon and participating in this event with us, and especially thank all the people who worked so hard to put it together for us. This is a collection, an edited collection of essays. So technically, I suppose I'm not a faculty author, but a faculty editor. Although I did write the introduction and the conclusion, so I did some writing in the book as well. I thought I would talk a little bit today about where I got the idea for the book and how it came, where it originated, and then through that process to kind of pass along a couple of takeaways, pieces of wisdom perhaps that maybe would be meaningful to others, especially to students, and what I learned through this process about myself and my career, where I wanted things to go in the future. So I first thought of this book in the spring of 2015. And it was really a kind of flash of insight, an epiphany. It was a realization that I am somebody. That's where the book came from. I'm somebody. Well, here's what happened. I was teaching a class on pirates at the time, and I was using a different book, also an edited collection of essays about pirates, that had been published in 2001. And the book was fine. It did its job. It collected the latest scholarship from the 1990s. Some of the essays went back into the 1980s. And as we were using the book during the class, during the semester, more and more I thought, you know, this is okay as a summary of where things were in 15 years ago, but surely there's been a lot of new work that's been done, and, you know, somebody should really come out with a new version of this book. And then, 10 seconds later, the insight. I'm somebody. I could do this. I had no idea how you put together an edited collection. Imagine you have an editor, had other people contribute. I didn't know how to do that. So I contacted my editor at the University of Georgia Press, which put out my first book, which at that point was in press, meaning that it's basically done and is ready to be published. And I asked him, how do you do an edited collection? And he gave me a couple of some insight there. We made arrangements to meet at a conference. So we met at a conference in the summer, and I told him about my idea and what I thought some of the benefits would be and how successful this previous book had been. It was still being used in classes 15 years after it was published. I said, surely, like pirates, we can steal that market share. So he said, okay, put together a proposal, recruit your crew, put your team together, and we'll take it from there. So that's what I did in the fall of 2015. I kind of sort of conceptualized what I wanted the book to be, what I thought would be most useful. Most useful for me as a teacher. I mean, if I'm going to put the thing together, I want to be able to use it for my own needs. And I put together a couple paragraph statement of what I thought the project should encompass. And I started emailing people. Now, one of the things that I've learned on the academic job search in the market is that people tell you no a lot. So I was ready to be rejected. And I came up with a list of about 30 names, probably, of people who could plausibly write about pirates. And I was shocked. A lot of people said yes, enthusiastically. They answered their email right away. I couldn't believe it. I got up to 15 people very shortly, within a couple of weeks' time. Now, a couple of those people backed out, and it didn't quite work out as planned. But before I knew it, within a month or so, within 6 weeks certainly, I had the team together. And from that point on, it was mostly about setting schedules and coordinating amongst the various contributors, communicating with the press and what their expectations were. And it was very much like a regular academic book proposal. So we had the proposal. It went out to readers who read the proposal and suggested some things. Some were helpful, others were not, things they said. I responded to that and said, no, this is going to be great. Don't worry about it. Then we got the contract, and it was approved. I set up a very tight, aggressive schedule for the contributors, and I held them to it. We didn't lose anybody along the way. Once they agreed to do it, everybody followed through, which was excellent. One of the things that attracted me to the editing project, and why I thought I was more than just somebody, but somebody who could do this, was I found at that time that editing really fit the time that I had available. I was actually working on another editing project, the encyclopedia, around the same time, which is different in that the publisher of the encyclopedia, they really had their vision, they'd already approved the project, they knew what they wanted, and I was kind of plugging in to execute what they were doing. This was more my idea. But I really liked the editing work. It fit the small pockets of time I had available. I had a very heavy teaching schedule at the time, and a very heavy service schedule, administrative schedule. And more than that, my time was really devoted to my family. We had our first daughter had been born in the fall of 2014. So my days as a grad student, when I wrote my first book, having hours at a time to write and to think and to be alone, that wasn't happening anymore. Between all the professional, personal obligations, I just couldn't do it. And I realized that if I was going to write another monograph, it was going to be till 2030 before I could have that kind of time again. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I'm never going to have time like that again. I would have to wait till my kids were grown. I didn't want to wait that long to do something, to write another book. I liked writing so much, just couldn't bear putting it on the back burner for so long. So editing really became a way to continue publishing, continue writing while I had these other obligations. I found that I could edit something in even an hour here and there. Hour after class, I could do it. 20 minutes between meetings. You can write an email threatening somebody to turn their stuff in. I could do that. I found that, I could hold the baby in one arm and do the mouse with the other. And that stage doesn't last very long. I was deceived in that. We had a golden month where I would hold her, she'd fall asleep for an hour, and then I could do every stuff. Yeah, now my two girls, they climb on me, so I have to learn how to do stuff with a mouse, like fight them with the other hand. They run off with it and all that kind of thing. So that's one of the things that appealed to me about doing this project, and what I really found is that it fit the time that I had available, and I really liked being productive in the time that I had. So the book was published this past summer, and I'm just spectacular, the people that I work with, their professionalism. They made deadlines, which for academics is very difficult. I guilted them into it sometimes, but the deadline coincided with when my second daughter was born. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, do you guys think you're busy? You're not as busy as I am. So that helped, I'm sure. So I'm very happy about that. I think a couple of takeaways for others, especially for students, is that when you're thinking of a project, to think very hard and carefully about feasibility. I think what happens to some people is they fall in love with a topic, it becomes their passion, and they try to find a way to fight to make it happen, but either you have to travel and you have other obligations, you can't travel, or you have other obligations professionally, personally, you just can't spend long periods of time on that. There's only 24 hours in a day, and you can be as efficient as you want, but you can't lengthen that time. And time always wins. Right? It always does. So to fight against that, I think, is very difficult. So now I'm looking for projects. That's my first consideration. Can I personally do this right now? Mm-hmm. And if the answer is no, then I have to let it go, even if it's something I'm really passionate about. Maybe there'll be time in some other place, but maybe it's just not right for me at that particular point. So really think carefully about that. Fit your project to your time, not your time to your project. That's something to really think carefully about. The other thing that I want to encourage everybody to think about is you are somebody, like I'm somebody. And if you identify a gap or a need in your readings, in the debates that you're having in your classes, especially in your teaching, if you think, this is something, we just do not have a book like this that does what I want to do. Mm-hmm. Well, you could be the person to write that book, and at the very least, you'll have that to use. It's very likely that other people are encountering the same difficulties. So that's my sort of takeaway. Where do you get ideas from? Think about what you have time for, and you might be the person to fill the gap that you've identified as existing. If it fits in your life, your family situation, professional situation, it has to all come together. And that's where the book came from. Thank you very much for being here and listening to my story about my origins of my book. I look forward to continuing to hear everyone else.
David, I have to say, I can't believe you got that whole talk without an R. Maybe later. Okay, our next speaker today is Dr. Duncan Hardy. He's, as far as the panelists, he's the newest addition to the UCF History Department. Dr. Hardy got his PhD in history from the University of Oxford in 2015. I'll say that again, the University of Oxford. You've heard of it? Decent place. His research interests are early modern Europe, late medieval Europe, Reformation history, political history, German history, Central Europe, the Holy Roman Empire, and political culture. So a whole lot of different things. Up to this point, he has published several articles, scholarly articles, in notable journals such as German History, Crusades, and the Journal of Medieval History. Today he's going to be talking about his first book, Associative Political Culture in the Holy Roman Empire. Dr. Hardy.
Thank you very much. If I may begin with a shameless plug, on the off chance that anyone is even slightly interested in purchasing the book, I do have flyers out on the display table outside as you go out, where you can get a discount. It's the US release date is in November, but it's already been out for a couple of weeks in the UK. So what you can see out there is a display copy of the UK edition, but the US edition will be very, very similar. So I'm going to start by echoing much of what has already been said, saying that really what's central to the process and content of any book project is the question that drives it, the question that lies behind your research, behind what you're trying to accomplish. So I'm mostly going to talk about that question and how my project developed out of that and how that question shaped the methodology and the writing process. So the central question that animates my book is, how can we talk about politics in a world without modern states? Politics in the most general sense of forms of government, the exercise of power by dominant social groups. How can we talk about that in a context where there is not a modern state? This might seem like an abstract starting point, but it goes straight to the heart of many of the assumptions that undergird the way historians have thought about medieval and early modern European history. So that's the period that I work on. And indeed, anyone in the room who may have read a textbook about European history on any period between, I don't know, the 13th and the 17th centuries will know that one of the most powerful narratives about this period is that it saw the formation of nation states. People groups, mostly speaking one language, governed by one monarchy or some other centralizing agency, coalescing into what would become modern European countries. Now, this model of historical change worked for the parts of Western Europe, like England, later Britain, like France. But since the birth of history in the 19th century as an academic discipline, the assumption has often been that it ought to be applicable to the whole continent. And so in most European countries, national history writing has been done in terms of goodies and baddies, with the good guys usually being monarchs and generals and ministers who advance the centralization of government, who enable territorial expansion, and who, most troublingly often, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, who promote ethnic homogenization. While the bad guys are those who obstruct this supposedly preordained process, like naughty princes who defend their private patrimonial interests, rather than supporting the inexorable progress of the birth of the nation and the strengthening of the state. Now, this powerful story about European history has always presented a profound problem for the German-speaking lands in Central Europe, because they were not united within a nation-state until 1871 in the case of Germany, and 1919 in the case of Austria. So for the best part of a millennium, including the centuries I studied, the 14th through 16th centuries, most of Central Europe was encompassed by a decentralized political framework, very unlike any modern nation state, called the Holy Roman Empire, in Latin the Sacrum Romanum Imperium, and in German the Heiliges Römisches Reich. And the very peculiarity of the Holy Roman Empire is what attracted me to it as a topic when I was starting out in graduate school. That and the fact that very little has been written about it in English. So I immersed myself in the German language historiography of the empire, hoping to find some interesting and convincing and creative attempts to model and articulate what it actually was and how it functioned. And what I quickly realized is that actually the very same obsession with state formation also haunts the way German historians think about the empire, with the key difference that whereas most national historiographies in Europe are triumphalist accounts of the birth of glorious ethnic states. German scholarship focuses mournfully on the perceived absence or deficiency of statehood in its pre-modern past. So already in the 19th century, for German historians of the Prussian school, the Holy Roman Empire was this anachronistic mirage that was to be condemned for leading German people astray from their preordained path that they should have taken, right, of working together to forge a German nation state. And in this narrative, the late medieval and early modern periods in particular come in for criticism as depressing times of fragmentation and decline, as weak emperors succeeded one another in civil wars, while the resources of the empire dwindled, and greedy princes, bishops, and towns pursued selfish local self-aggrandizement, weakening each other in internecine feuds, while that situation was then further worsened in the 16th century by the confessional divisions of the Reformation. Now, it is true that in the last few decades, German historians have tried to take a somewhat more positive view of the Holy Roman Empire, but they've done so not by accepting that it wasn't a conventional state and seeking some other way to make sense of it, but rather by trying to save the state, by arguing that statehood was in fact delegated to what they call territorial states, Territorialstaaten, principalities, bishoprics, imperial cities, and so on, that are said to have formed a kind of Jackson Pollock-esque map, right, a patchwork map across Central Europe. So when I started out as a doctoral student, I thought I'd be following in the footsteps of these recent German historians, basically investigating some of these little states and working out how they functioned. And I set my sights on the southerly regions of the empire, broadly Oberdeutschland, Upper Germany, so modern-day Switzerland, Western Austria, Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria, and Alsace. And what I quickly realized once I visited some of the archives in these different regions is that there's very little evidence that the political entities here really corresponded with something that we could reasonably call territorial states. To call them states is a gross exaggeration. Certainly none of them match up to Max Weber's much used definition of a state as a well-defined territorial zone inhabited by a community with agreed agencies and institutions that have the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. On the contrary, what we see is local governments and their agents constantly feuding with one another and then reconciling their differences in complex ritualized arbitrations and assemblies. And there's no semblance of any kind of institutionalized judicial or fiscal system under any of these nobles or churchmen or cities. They instead preside over these fragmented and overlapping combinations of assets and jurisdictions with officers who often serve multiple rulers or hold fiefs from multiple lords at the same time. So I find records, for example, of villages which have over 20 different landlords, none of whom have what we might think of as sovereign authority over more than a few fields. So if we're going to call these entities states, I'd suggest that we have to so change the scope of that word as to basically render it meaningless. And what I did find instead was copious evidence of collaboration and joint regulation between these fragmented authorities within treaties, multilateral treaties and contracts that I call associations, hence the title of the book, Associative Political Culture. So that might sound like a bit of a weird title, but it's my attempt to find a way to talk about this form of politics where there's no single agency that we can call the state, but where we nevertheless have many political actors and institutions, all overlapping, cooperating, jostling for influence within sprawling social networks, and with this Holy Roman Empire providing the only loose framework that gives any kind of ideological coherence to the political landscape. So it remains to be seen how other historians of the empire are going to judge this, and I do await with trepidation word from colleagues in Germany and Switzerland who will be reading and quite possibly reviewing the book in the coming months. But I will say by way of conclusion that what I've learned from the experience of writing this book, first as a doctoral student, so it comes out of my dissertation, and then in a kind of second round of turning that dissertation into the book and adding chapters and so on. What I've learned is the importance of engaging deeply with the historiography as soon as possible, because you really can't work out what questions you're going to be asking of a mass of primary sources and producing interesting and worthwhile interpretations of them until you know where you stand in relation to the existing narratives and paradigms. And the greatest challenge, certainly for me, was working out the so what factor, right? Why should anyone care about this topic? It was only when I'd spent several years really getting to grips with the big picture models of European political history, some of which have obvious flaws and presuppositions, that I could confidently talk about the fact they were unsuited to the evidence that I was looking at, and then shape the structure of my book and the argument of the book accordingly. So that's my parting takeaway message, particularly for any graduate students in the room or any undergraduates who are thinking about going on to graduate study, is never neglect the historiography. It ought to shape your project profoundly. And by the same token, don't be afraid to challenge even very powerful narratives and models that you find if the primary source evidence you are reading does not work and fit with those models. Have the courage to challenge it, and you will likely produce very interesting work.
Thank you, Dr. Hardy. Our final speaker today is Dr. Luis Martínez-Fernández. Dr. Martínez-Fernández is a professor of history at UCF. He received his PhD in Latin American history from Duke University, and his research interests are Latin America, Caribbean, Cuba and Puerto Rico, Latinos in the United States, and higher education. As far as his publications, I'll say it this way. I forget the number of books he's published. Whenever you forget the number of books someone's published, that means they published many books. I'll just highlight, there are at least 5, maybe more. In 2014, he published Revolutionary Cuba, a history, which earned the honorable mention from the International Latino Book Awards in 2015. And today he's going to talk about his newest publication. I should say this too. Dr. Martínez-Fernández is one of the senior scholars of our department. And by senior, I don't mean that he's old. I'm not saying you're old. I'm saying he's been a scholar for a long time. So what you might find by listening to what he's saying is his insights are a little different than some you've heard before. But what he's going to talk about today is his newest book, He Did the New World, A History of Early Colonial Cuba. Dr. Martínez-Fernández.
Thank you, Dan, for those kind words. I also want to thank Tiffany, who's out there, who I saw bringing some bags of food, and she's kept an eye so that everything goes perfectly. I'm going to start with a quote. It's a quote from a professor. It's not really a quote, but let me get there. So there's this professor who's at a cocktail party, and he's talking to somebody about himself. The other person had a lot of patience, but then he says, well, enough about me. Let me tell you about my book. So that's what I'm going to do today, and I'm going to throw in other things as well. I'm going to be very honest with you. I am delighted to see this gathering. This is countercultural, you know? Not just in the world in general, but within the universities. I remember when the humanities were at the heart of any major important university. And I think a lot about that, and I think about metrics. So I see you were counting my books. So, but how do you measure the impact of this kind of gathering, which I am very sure, just like it did for me many, many years ago, you get some seeds planted in your brain about books, about projects, about doing things, about methods that may give fruit 20 years from now. How do you measure that? How do you put that in a glossy annual report? You can't do it. And now that I said that, I'm going to say that I am saying that because the experience of writing this book has a lot to do with that. Professors, dedicated professors that I had at the University of Puerto Rico, at Duke University, who were medievalists. I was trained under, one of them was a medievalist who became a historian of the Caribbean, but these were colonialists. And I learned so much from them, but I strayed and I worked on the 19th century and contemporary Puerto Rico, which some could argue that because Puerto Rico is still a colony, if you study contemporary Puerto Rico, you're a colonialist. In any event, I had those seeds planted in my brain about the importance of the origins of early colonial Cuba. I was also interested, David, in filling some gaps, and one of them, well, I'll tell you what happened. This book is supposed to come out many years ago. But what happened was that I had an encounter with somebody in Las Vegas, of all places, in a rather seedy hotel, because that's where the Latin American Studies Association decided to have us stay. And I remember, that metal furniture, very strange, by the swimming pool. It was like a mafia meeting, I guess. And I told Lou Perez, I'm very excited because I'm going to write a book about early colonial Cuba. And Lou Perez is the dean of Cuban studies in this country. And he said, Luis, why do you do that? Nobody cares about early colonial Cuba. And he said, why don't you write a book about the Cuban Revolution, which people care about? And I was going to stick with my plan, but a few months later, he invited me to collaborate with a reader about the Cuban Revolution, and I wrote a chapter that it turned out to be very long, and I said, well, I have 75 pages. I might as well add a little bit and have a book. Bad idea, because of course, I needed to write a comprehensive history of the Cuban Revolution, which, by the way, nobody had written a history book that was comprehensive about the Cuban Revolution. Because what's out there are readers and volumes, edited volumes. So I did that. I don't know whether it was a blessing or a curse, but when you write about the Cuban Revolution, you're going to alienate almost everybody to your right, your left. You alienate yourself. And then I decided I'm going to get as far as I can from that. So I'm going to start working with this book that starts with, actually, I was going to say that it starts with the indigenous, but for this book, I had to research tectonic plate movements and formations of soil and things that I wasn't that interested in. And I wrote this book. I never left the classroom, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so happy to see you here. I started in school. My mom put me in school when I was 3.5 years old in Lima, Peru. It was a Catholic school. If we get a chance to talk someday, I can explain why my mom decided to put me in school when I was 3.5 years old. It was a good decision. But I fell in love with school. And I still have to this day my atlas, my third grade atlas that I bought for my schoolwork. Now, all of the countries have changed, okay? So it's not useful in that regard. But then I fell in love with the university and the University of Puerto Rico, and it was ideas. It was ideas that captivated me. And I had wonderful professors. And they are all here in one way or another. The two colonialist professors that I had, John Topasky from Duke, Aida Caro Costas from the University of Puerto Rico, my professor, my dear professor, Fernando Picó, a Jesuit priest who had enough patience to deal with his Protestant disciple. And he told us a few things that I think are still good advice. He said, Luis, take risks. Luis, dare to surprise people. And another one that was related, keep your own voice. And I'm sharing that advice because, being a historian is not a valley of roses. Everybody has an uncle or a grandfather that out of love says, what are you doing studying history? And it's out of love. So now that we take that step to be countercultural, then we might as well take it all the way, right? And do what we think is right, and not just be blown by waves of historiography that come and go. I want this book to be special. And one of the things that I learned when I wrote the book about the Cuban Revolution was, I know I'm going to take a lot of flack, therefore, everything has to be as perfect as it can in order to protect the book. Well, that didn't keep some critics from saying very strange things. Some of your colleagues in England, my goodness, they were very harsh. I mean, he even mentioned my father, who was an anti-Castro activist, and I wrote, because you can reply. He said, you must know things that I don't know, because I lived with my father 40 plus years and I never heard of that. So what is this book about? This book is a synthesis. And I like to write synthetic books, which doesn't sound very good. I like to write books that are synthesis, because I think that there's too much, and that was one of the things that I rebelled against. When I was a graduate student, it was all about microhistory. And my classmates were writing little projects about, Puerto Rico's already micro to begin with, but they were writing projects about the merchants in this little town, or the purchase and sale of slaves in that other little town. And I really didn't have much of patience for that. And I always went for the larger ideas, which, by the way, it's not a great recommendation for students who are writing their first, the dissertation on the first book. I got away with it, and I wrote about Cuba and Puerto Rico, which was a comparative study. One of the things that I tried to do in this book, sometimes I've shared in class with my students a cartoon from the Chronicle of Higher Education that I just love, and it's making fun of historians, and we sort of deserved it many times. And this is the cartoon, if you can visualize it. There's a historian with a camera. Well, there's somebody with a camera, and it's looking at a very fuzzy scenario. It's not clear. It's like Jackson Pollock painting. It's not very clear. And then the historian is tinkering with the antennas. And televisions back then used to have antennas. And he's tinkering with that so that he gets a picture that is perfect, and you see some human beings represented, but the reality is very fuzzy. And that's one of the things that we try to do. We try to make something very clear out of things that are very fuzzy and complicated. And I try to do that in this book. It wasn't easy. So I had 3 tracks. Number 1, I wanted to make sure that it was a book about the Atlantic, the broader context, macro level. That was number 1. Number 2, because it was about Cuba, that I would focus on certain locales in Cuba. Havana was one of them, some sugar plantations were others. And then 3, something that I insist so much that we need more. We need histories about real people who had first names and last names, and who cried, and who fell in love, and who got sick. But we don't write history like that. We write about people as if they're robots. And what I'm going to do, I don't know how much time I have left. Maybe 2 minutes? 2 minutes? 2 minutes? Well, what I did was I selected a number of characters that I interjected into this narrative. And I'll share you just a couple of them. Let's see. Okay, this is one of my favorite characters. This is in Cuba, 1580. Captain Melchor Sardo de Arana arrived in Havana to take charge as alcalde of the Castillo de la Real Fuerza fortification. The fort, which had just been finished, housed a 50-man garrison. Sardo de Arana moved into the fort with his wife and mother-in-law, an arrangement that irritated Captain General Gabriel de Luján. Captain General also complained about Sardo de Arana's behavior, accusing him of neglecting his responsibilities, of engaging against the law in lucrative commercial ventures. And the Protocolo records, which are the Spanish history, so fascinating because Spaniards were so bureaucratic and everything had to be notarized and triplicate, and there's a lot to find. So in these protocolos, they document these sales of imported goods, most likely contraband, to local merchants. According to witnesses who testified against them on one occasion, at the house of a fellow officer, he dressed up in a petticoat and a turban and performed a sketch in which he mimicked a street prostitute. His behavior in public also earned him censure. Reportedly, he was wearing a negligee when buying meat at the market. During his juicio de residencia, that's a post-tenure review, Sardo de Arana, we don't want that here, other tenures. During his juicio de residencia, Sardo de Arana was accused of behaving like a, quote, low person who had compromised the dignity of his office by, among other things, buying a fried plantain, the staple of the Afro-Cuban diet, from a woman street vendor, an African-derived practice. He ate it right then and there, continued the accusation, and he burned his tongue. The implicit accusation was that he had ceased to be a Spaniard and had become something else. He had become aplatanado, which the best translation is he became banana-like. as generations of creolized Spaniards would continue to be for centuries. One more. In 1976, as thousands of Cuban soldiers, most of them descendants of slaves, were fighting in Angola on the side of the MPLA, Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, renowned Cuban historian Manuel Moreno Frajinals published a short piece entitled Manuel de Angola in the national newspaper Granma, the only one, I should add. In it, he described how Manuel, whose African name is unknown, was baptized in a collective ceremony, most likely soon after he arrived in Cuba. Baltasar Gonzalez, a priest, officiated the ceremony on October 7, 1685. In preparation for the baptism, the priest anointed Manuel with consecrated oil. An Ararat couple from Dahomey, Andres and Francisca, stood as godparents. Moreno Frajinals, the historian, wrote that Manuel, quote, was from over there, and 3 centuries later is from here. Meaning, thank you, meaning that he had always been both African and Cuban. And these are the people that are really interesting. I mean, we still haven't gotten beyond, the focus on the great man of history. We still do that for some reason, but I like to have fun with my research, and I encourage you to always have fun with your research and writing.
Thank you. Okay, everyone, we still have a few minutes, so if you have any questions, please ask. Just raise your hand, and we'll let you ask whatever you want to.
So Dr. Gannon, in your book, you were talking about the Civil War. So it sounds like there was a popular perception, and you're uncovering facts that go against that popular perception, how did that influence your work, how you wrote it, the point you wanted to make? I mean, if I have the wrong impression of history, how difficult is it, or how much of a challenge is it to get me to change my point of view?
Well, I mean, one of the things I spent a lot of time actually, and one of my main points in the book is a lot of the things that transmitted are popular culture, movies and TV and visiting battlefields. So I spend a lot of time on that. But I think the really most subversive thing in the book, and it's pretty darn subversive, is that I say historians were part and parcel of this misperception. So I studied what historians said and then wrote in textbooks, which are really the most ignored key to memory, about the Civil War. It was historians who would write things about how benign slavery was and how abolitionists were troublemakers, and not just Southern historians. It was historians who wrote that the war wasn't about slavery, that it was about something else. I mean, probably the most subversive thing in that book is I'm saying, look, we're part and parcel of it. It's not just people, there was a basis for what people believed, and historians were part of it. And one of the great issues is, particularly when historians became very professionalized at the end of the 19th century, a lot of them really went off the rails about the war and what it was about for their own reasons. So yes, popular perceptions are rooted in historical work.
Good questions.
I have a question for Dr. Head.
Yes.
So you mentioned that one of the reasons that you wrote the book or you edited the book was because it wasn't useful to you in class, or it wasn't as useful as something more recent would have been. So I guess my question is, when you were choosing the essayists and when you were editing their work, how much of that focus was on what would be useful to your class, or like what you would want to teach? Do you think that affected like how you edited the works?
So at the editing stage, not so much. I mean, there is really making sure there's clarity, that, you know, as well written as it could be, is accessible and all that kind of thing. More so, how it affected my teaching, where my interest in my teaching, what I wanted to be useful, that came in the conceptualization of the book. So, for example, this is about Caribbean piracy, mostly in the 17th and 18th century. You can easily do the global history. The previous volume that I was my competitor, whose title I will not mention. There's a chapter. That book had chapters on Chinese piracy, on Mediterranean piracy, and ancient piracy. And when I teach the class, I don't want to do that. I want to do the pirates of the Caribbean. Also, another focus that I had that I could never find anything, and scholarship really was very good, that would bear on this question that students always want to talk about, was the popular culture part of this, right? How is it that pirates become so popular? And one of the things I wondered, so I made sure that I try to get several essays on that topic broadly conceived. So yes, at the conceptualization level, it was fairly selfish in the sense that I wanted something that at least I could use in the way that I wanted to teach the course. So at that level is where it mostly came out. So thanks for asking.
David, you were very helpful with my work because one of the chapters deals with piracy, and you kindly read it. Ezekiel also read, because I was writing about African religions, and our dear friend Simon Barton also read a chapter. And he read it when he was very busy, and he was in Spain, and he had made the commitment, and I know he didn't have the time, but he sent it to me, and I was able to benefit from his help. So what we do is largely collaborative in one way or another.
Good questions. Questions? Okay, well, in a sense, that's a good thing, because now we have a little time. If you would like to speak to any of these authors, please do. And I hope what you're getting from this today is historical scholarship at UCF is very vibrant, it's very diverse, and it's related to today's modern issues. So please talk to them, get their insights, and then you go out and do the exact same thing. Thank you all for being here today.
I had to say
my friend.